everyone, and welcome to the 2017 Kenner Lecture, featuring Dr. Camara Jones, Wellesley class of 1976. My name is Amina
And my name is Shreya, and today we have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Paula Johnson to all of you, who will then welcome Dr. Jones back to campus.
We'd like to begin by thanking the individuals and departments whose generous contributions are what made this event possible. We'd like to thank Africana Studies, American Studies, Anthropology, Education, Peace and Justice Studies, Political Science, Sociology, Harambe House, the Partnerships for Diversity and Inclusion, and Wellesley Centers for Women. We'd like to extend a special thank you to the Women and Gender Studies Department and the Albright Institute for Global Affairs, the two co-hosts of this event.
Abina and I are speaking to you today because both of our Wellesley experiences have been greatly shaped by the Women's and Gender Studies Department and the Albright Institute. I'm a Women and Gender Studies major, and Abina is part of the new Health and Society minor that is offered by the department. Additionally, we were both Albright Fellows over this past winter session. We are particularly proud to be associated with these two programs, who have time and time again demonstrated their commitment to challenging the Wellesley community to think deeper about issues that are often ignored, such as today's topic of racism and health.
Wellesley has a history of bringing together individuals who shifted the frameworks of what is considered normal within their fields, for which there is no better example than our president, President Paula Johnson. Being two of her biggest fans, we could stand here and list off President Johnson's many accomplishments in the fields of healthcare, education, and gender equity. But instead, we would like to take this time to speak about how she has changed the Wellesley campus in just 8 short months.
The first time the students heard from Dr. Johnson was over the summer, before many of us had met her in person. She sent a campus-wide email acknowledging the violence occurring around the country. She explicitly addressed issues of race and class injustices, demonstrated the trust she places in the student body, and showed us the type of president that Wellesley was about to welcome. Since then, we have seen President Johnson at the forefront of many of our community-led movements, marching at the front of our peace walk in Babson, offering comfort to those who remained in the field house the night of the election, speaking out at our rally for immigration rights just a few weeks ago, and elevating Wellesley's voice around the country through publications in the New York Times as well as others.
Somehow, in addition to all of these actions and the day-to-day of leading Wellesley College, President Johnson, affectionately known as PJ, manages to make students feel truly heard and appreciated. She does this by responding to every single email from a student, and we know we send a lot of emails. She spent hours dancing with us at her inaugural soiree. She spent the time and took the time to shake every senior's hand at senior reception and to get to know each and every one of their names. She attends athletic events and cultural shows all around campus. And we know that this is an incredibly difficult time to be Wellesley's president, and Dr. Johnson has risen to meet every challenge with grace and dignity.
Abina and I are both pre-health, so having this type of role model, someone who uses their knowledge of healthcare in such an unconventional way, has been truly inspiring. Dr. Johnson exemplifies everything that Wellesley College stands for, and as upper-class women who will soon be graduating, we are both so grateful to experience Wellesley with her as our president. Without further delay, we would like to welcome President Johnson to the stage.
Thank you, Abina and Shreya. That was such a beautiful introduction. I was speechless. I also thank you for your passion on issues of health and equity, because I think it speaks volumes for who our students are and what the next generation is. And I think that is, particularly in this time, this uncertain time, such an important statement, because all of you are the future. And it is what gets us up every single day to do what we do. And I want to just welcome all of you, students, staff, faculty, returning alumni, and guests to the 2017 Kerner Lecture. And the Kerner Lecture is one of the highlights of the academic year. And I do want to say, as Abina and Shreya said, this lecture being really sponsored jointly by both Women and Gender Studies and the Albright Institute I think really is so important and speaks to the intersection of how we think about the totality of issues that we face, health, wellness, and you can name any other. But I do want to thank Charlene and Joanne for your support here. Hyunja, yes. Hyunja Laskin Kenner, class of '88, and her husband, Jeffrey Kenner, couldn't be here today, but we're profoundly grateful to them. It's their generosity and commitment to Wellesley that makes this annual lecture possible. I want to also just briefly recognize two other special guests here today. Trustee Ophelia Dahl. Ophelia, where are you? Ophelia Dahl. Co-founder and chair of the board of Partners in Health. And I don't think I have to say any more. You all know this amazing organization has been transformative to global health. And Ophelia, thank you for not only what you've done around the world, but also what you do for Wellesley. So thank you. And her colleague, Dr. Michelle Morse, is here with her. Michelle, welcome. So now to the business of why we are here. And I cannot tell you how thrilled I am on both a professional and deeply personal level to welcome Dr. Camara Jones to give the Kerner Lecture this year. Camara is a leader in public health, a champion of health equity, a champion of social justice, a renowned investigator, a distinguished Wellesley alumna, class of '76, and a colleague and a friend. Camara and I go way back. I went to college with her twin sisters. I'm just going to say I went to college with her twin sisters. And one of her twin sisters hosted me on my very first medical school interview. She was a few years ahead of me. And I think it speaks to even if you didn't go to a women's college, it does speak to the bonds that tie us, to the sisterhood that ties us and lasts for a lifetime. And so we are so fortunate to have you, Camara. Your achievement, your unique insight and compassion will really be evidenced as you give us your address, Achieving Health Equity, Tools for a National Campaign Against Racism. Dr. Jones's message is one that resonates deeply for us here at Wellesley and for me personally. Having spent my own career studying how sex and gender and health are related, it was very clear to me very early on that all too often the disciplines of looking at issues of sex and gender and then looking at issues of race and ethnicity lived and continue in many arenas to live in silos. And over the years, part of my work was to break down those silos. And it was truly a great honor to collaborate with my colleague and friend, Dr. Camara Jones, particularly during her time at the Harvard School of Public Health. Dr. Jones has been a trailblazer in connecting race and racism with health and well-being. And I just want to focus on that because that was really and is today, a groundbreaking connection. We think about race, but we don't think about the components associated with race. She is the kind of trailblazer we so greatly need, initiating a national conversation on racism that will have lasting effects on public health and how we conceive of and create health and wellness in society. I know that we can learn a great deal from her as we continue to model for the world a campus focused on equity as a critical element to excellence, offering an educational experience that prepares women leaders to apply lessons learned in the classroom to real-world problems in service to the greater good. And this isn't to say that we still don't have a huge amount to learn. We are still in that evolutionary process, and I view today's lecture as critical as part of that evolution. But Dr. Jones has done and is doing that. She is a family physician and an epidemiologist whose work is helping to expand the national health debate in multiple areas. First, public health and equity, and how health is affected by poverty and racism, as well as universal access to high-quality health care. As a social epidemiologist, her work on race-associated differences in health outcomes has brought about vigorous investigations onto the structural causes of those differences. Excuse my voice. As a teacher, she has crafted compelling allegories on race and racism, telling stories that help us understand difficult topics and illuminating issues often neglected or given short shrift in contemporary discourses on health and wellness. Dr. Jones taught at the Harvard School of Public Health from 1994 to 2000. She was a medical officer at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention from 2000 to 2014. And she's currently a senior fellow at the Satcher Health Leadership Institute and the Cardiovascular Research Institute at Morehouse's School of Medicine. She is the immediate past president of the American Public Health Association, which means that she was really helping to set the national agenda in public health. After earning her BA in molecular biology from Wellesley College, she received her MD at Stanford and both her Master's of Public Health and her PhD in epidemiology from Johns Hopkins. Her leadership in her field is well known and widely admired. She serves and has served on many boards and has been honored with many awards for her research and for her service. She is a caring practitioner whose career is defined by her drive to change society for the better. She is an ingenious methodologist, a pioneering researcher, a warrior for social justice. I'm going to say that again because I think it's important. Pioneering researcher, a warrior for social justice, and a dedicated educator. So it is my honor, I'm going to say Camara, to welcome you back to Wellesley, and I am so thrilled to be here to welcome you.
With her as president of Wellesley College. I have to say that since I got, even on my way into campus, people have just been remarking, Dr. Johnson, about how you make them proud to be Wellesley. How you're just doing a great job. And I'm delighted to see this room full of leaders. Women leaders. I'm happy. This is the first time that I've come back to campus to speak in those 40 plus years since I graduated. So this is really an honor for me. And what I want to do is not speak at you. I want us to have a conversation. Even before I say, okay, now everybody run to the mics. So as I share with you some of the tools that I've been sharing across the country as president of the American Public Health Association, tools for a national campaign against racism. If I say something and you're like, oh no, that's not my experience, or if you say, oh my God, I lived that yesterday, or if you even just want to give me an amen, please, by all means, raise your hand. And I will recognize you because I don't want to come and open up my shiny toolbox and share some of my stories and definitions with you and then wrap them back up. Really what this is about is for you to hear some of the stories, see some of the data, listen to some of the frameworks and definitions, and then understand them so deeply that you can share at least one of these tools tonight with a roommate or a family member or a professor or just somebody on the train with you. Well, let me just start by saying that The three tasks in the national campaign against racism are really to name racism, to say the whole word, not just say race, not just, it's important to talk about cultural competence, it's important to talk about implicit bias, all those things are important things, but we also need to say the word racism and get the ism out, right? Because that is the system that's making race permanent. So the first task is to name racism, the second is to ask, how is racism operating here? And the third is to organize and strategize to act. So the three tasks that I'm going to illustrate in the tools that you cannot read now, I know you can't read that, under name racism, ask how is racism operating here, and organize and strategize to act. But by the end, we're going to cover all of these tools, okay? The first thing is what I call my clip analogy. It's a cartoon animation that's my answer when people say, why are you as a family physician, as a social epidemiologist, why are you even talking about racism at all? Get back into your health sector, if you will. So I'm going to share with you my clip analogy, which describes different levels of health intervention and illustrates why attention to issues of racism are key, crucial to really handling any health issues. So here we go. Oh, it's doing the thing again. Oh, wow. Okay, that's all right. So we're not going to use slides today. We're just, okay? Is that all right? Because it's just not. Okay. So here we go. Imagine somebody boom! Somebody falls off of the cliff of good health. If that were you or somebody in your family, you would be delighted to find an ambulance at the bottom of the cliff to speed you on to care. But if we were concerned about other people along that cliff face, if we were concerned about population health, community health, public health, we might well ask ourselves, what could we do? What could we put in place as a health intervention besides just stationing lots of ambulances at the bottom of the cliff? And somebody in this room is going to say, I know, let's put a net halfway down. Because even if people fall, we can catch them before they get crunched up at the bottom. Excellent idea. Although the more you think about it, nets do have holes in them, so some people might fall through the cracks. But that's all right. We can even make that a trampoline halfway down that cliff. No holes in a trampoline. But even if we had a trampoline halfway down that cliff face, we might find ourselves with lots of people just bouncing up and down at half functionality, not able to get back to the top of the cliff. So what else could you put in place as a health intervention? Well, clearly we need to be thinking about a fence at the end of the cliff to keep people from falling in the first place. But it doesn't have to be a very, very strong fence if there's a lot of population pressure against it. So what else can we do as a health intervention? We can move the population away from the edge of the cliff. So let me identify the levels of health intervention that I've described so far, where the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff clearly represents medical care, and what we in public health describe as tertiary prevention. That is, preventing complications from disease that's already manifest, like preventing amputations from diabetes. That's the ambulance. The net or trampoline halfway down, these are our safety net programs, often in our social services, as well as secondary prevention, which is about early detection, screening programs. The fence represents primary prevention, keeping bad things from happening in the first place, for example, immunization. And moving the population away from the edge of the cliff is what we are describing as addressing the social determinants of health. Addressing those determinants of health and illness that are outside of the individual. They're beyond our individual genes and they're beyond our individual behaviors. And they are, in fact, the context in which our behaviors either arise and convey risk or benefit. So these social determinants of health include individual contexts like individual income or wealth, individual education, and the like. And poverty is a huge social determinant of health. They also include neighborhood conditions. So in your neighborhood, can you find fresh fruits and vegetables? Do you live in what some people describe as a food desert and what other people describe as a fast food swamp? How are the schools in your neighborhood? How is the housing? Are there jobs in your neighborhood? And even if there are jobs, is there transportation to a job? What are the playgrounds like? Is that where the children can frolic and play and commune with nature, or is that where drugs are being sold? What is the relationship? What is the safety on the street? Can you walk 30 minutes a day, 5 days a week? Are there street lights? Is there a sidewalk? Are the police in an antagonistic relationship with you and your children? So we have the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff, we have the netted trampoline halfway down, we have the fence, we have moving the population away from the edge of the cliff. If we were thinking about infant mortality rates, the ambulance would clearly represent, neonatal intensive care units, right? And the net or trampoline might be prenatal care, early detection of problems, screening pregnant women. The fence might be excellent maternal nutrition. WIC programs. Moving the population might be excellent educational opportunities so that young women, young girls didn't have babies so soon, or it might be a living wage so that women who are pregnant were not living in poverty. This is a nice diagram that you could go into a community with and have a conversation about how should we be spending our health resources? How much in ambulances versus nets versus fences versus moving the population? But there's a fatal flaw so far in this diagram that I've illustrated for you. The fatal flaw is that so far it doesn't equip us to talk about how health disparities arise. So I want you to keep that cliff that I've imagined for you in the back of your mind. And we're going to shift gears for just a moment to think about how health disparities arise on 3 levels, and then we're going to come back to the thing. So, how do health disparities arise? Well, especially when you talk about racial ethnic health disparities, which have a very long history in our nation. And they occur across age groups and across organ systems and the like. When you talk about racial ethnic health disparities, we unfortunately have lots of evidence about differences in the quality of care received within the healthcare system. So in 2002, the Institute of Medicine released its unequal treatment report, which basically pulled together hundreds of studies documenting even considering people in the same healthcare system. So everybody in the VA system, or everybody covered by Medicare or Medicaid, even within a given hospital system, for those who look, there might be differences in how vigorously your chest pain would be investigated depending on your race, or differences in how much pain medication you would get if you walked into an emergency department with a long bone fracture, depending on your ethnicity or race. Now that was a revelation to the healthcare industry, but the Institute of Medicine knew that that was not the end-all and be-all of how health disparities arise, because they said, hey, we're here. It's not just what happens within the healthcare system. Some people are having trouble accessing healthcare in the first place. So that's the second level at which health disparities arise. But I'm hoping that everybody in this room recognizes that health is not created within the health sector. So there's a third level at which health disparities arise, which are differences in the conditions of our lives. Differences in our life opportunities, exposures, and stresses, which are making some individuals and populations sicker than others in the first place. And then very often you have, the sicker ones frustrated because of limited access to care, and then even the lucky ones who get into the healthcare system sometimes injured because of differences in the quality of care. You could think of it as a pyramid, or better yet, you could think of it as an iceberg with a huge base of the differences in the conditions of our lives. So now I'm thinking about these 3 levels in which health disparities arise: differences in quality of care, differences in access to care, and differences in underlying exposures and opportunities. We go back to the cliff, but now we're going to recognize we're not dealing with a flat 2-dimensional cliff, but we're actually dealing with a 3-dimensional cliff. And at some parts of the cliff, there might be an ambulance there, but maybe this ambulance has a flat tire, so it's slow or goes off in the wrong direction. Or maybe there's no ambulance there, and maybe there's no net nor fence. And usually at those parts of the cliff, the population is being pushed closer to the edge. So now that we recognize that we're dealing with a 3-dimensional cliff, there's a whole new set of questions that arise. First of which is, how did the cliff become 3-dimensional in the first place? And that's usually because of historical injustices that are perpetuated by present-day contemporary structural factors. But given that the cliff is 3-dimensional, we also need to ask, why are there differences in how resources are distributed along the cliff face? And why are there differences in who's found at different parts of the cliff? Because if you saw my drawing, you'd ask, why are the oranges back here and away? And why are the greenies being pushed closer to the edge? And when you start asking and addressing those kinds of questions, you're now doing something that differs from addressing the social determinants of health, which is all about moving the population away from the edge of the cliff. When you start asking about the distribution of resources and populations, you are now addressing the social determinants of equity or inequity, where these social determinants of equity or inequity are systems of power that can distribute resources and populations. So they include racism, sexism, heterosexism, economic systems like capitalism and the like. And actually with this clip, I've distilled 3 different dimensions of health intervention. And if you go back to your junior high or high school geometry, 1 dimension is a line, 2 dimensions is a flat plane, 3 dimensions is space. Well, along the line at the edge of the cliff is where we can display all of our curative and preventive health services. Our ambulance, net, and fence right there on the edge of the cliff. And in fact, when we were celebrating the passage of the Affordable Care Act, as limited as it was, but we were trying to get further to get to universal access to high-quality healthcare. That conversation was all still an edge-of-the-cliff conversation. And let me say that I'm clear that we need universal access to high-quality healthcare. Not because, thank you, but not because that in and of itself is going to result in large and sustained improvements in health outcomes or the elimination of health disparities. The reason that we must insist on universal access to high-quality health care is that is how a civilized society values all of its people equally. But no matter how wonderful the system is, we can overwhelm any system if people are pushed up against the edge of it. So we must move into that second dimension, which we can display in a flat plane. We must be about addressing the social determinants of health by moving the population away from the edge of the cliff, addressing poverty, adverse neighborhood conditions, and the like, if we want to have large and sustained improvements in health outcomes. But the trick there is that if we are moving the population away from the edge of the cliff without recognizing that we're really dealing with a 3-dimensional cliff, we are at risk of moving some of the population, but not all of the population, and actually making health disparities worse. So we must acknowledge and address the 3-dimensionality of the cliff. We must name and address racism, sexism, heterosexism, capitalism, and the like, if we're going to achieve social justice and eliminate health disparities. Now, I use that clip for lots of ways and for lots of different audiences. Sometimes I simply say, I've said the word racism 2 or 3 times and nobody fell off the chair, so let's go, right? But I also use it with health audiences. I ask the question sometimes, why do we spend so much money on ambulances? And in fact, often I'm speaking to medical students who are trying to be the best ambulance drivers they can be, right? And we need excellent ambulance drivers. We want them there when our parents or we ourselves or our family members or our community members are in need of care, when we've fallen off the edge of that cliff. But the reason that we do that is in part because there's a lot of money being made there, but it's also in part that we don't even conceive of ill health until people have fallen off the cliff. We are a sickness care enterprise in this country. We don't even have good measures for community health. It's all an individual matter. Somebody fell off the cliff, okay, we got to save them. Oh, somebody else. We don't even talk about how close is the community to the edge. With measures of, say, social cohesion or income inequality, we have some of those, but we're not routinely using them. And the people who are busy picking up bodies at the bottom are often so busy, they don't even look up to see, is there a net above me? How is the fence working? Is there one? Much less to think about the proximity of people to the edge and the 3-dimensionality of the cliff. So no matter where we are, we need some of all of this in our health enterprise, right? But we will not be successful until we address all of it. And wherever you are working, as a citizen or your day job in the health enterprise, all of us have a citizen role. So even if you're trying to be the best ambulance driver, in your off time, in your citizen role, you need to be addressing the issues of inequity, right? And I have to just say this right now. However many committees or things you were on, citizen things, engagements you had on November 8th, you need to add at least one more. I'm just saying, we cannot curl up and hope this thing is going to pass over us. We need to reach out to one another and grasp, very firm, like Velcro grasp. We need to be a Velcro wall, that people can't get through. We need to be standing up, and that's the citizen role that's beyond any of our day jobs. But let me turn now to racism, because when I say the word racism, I've just justified addressing racism as a physician and epidemiologist by saying that it's one of those social determinants of equity or inequity that we must address if we're going to set things right in our nation. How do I define racism? What do I mean? How can I, I was president of APHA all last year, how did I dare go and talk to people in Montana or Idaho or Oklahoma? How did I dare say that word? What did I expect? Well, when I say the word racism, I'm clear that I'm talking about a system. I am not talking about an individual character flaw, or a personal moral failing, or even a psychiatric illness, as some people have suggested. But I'm talking about a system of power. And a system of doing what? It's a system of structuring opportunity and of assigning value. And on what basis is the opportunity structured, and on what basis is the value assigned? It's based on so-called race, based on the social interpretation of how we look, which is what we call race in this country. Now here I am in Wellesley, Massachusetts. You look at me and I am clearly black. But in some parts of Brazil today, you would look at me and I would be just as clearly white. In South Africa, you look at me, I'd be just as clearly colored. Here I've just given you 3 different locations, but same physical appearance, but the social interpretation of my physical appearance in those 3 settings would assign me to 3 different racial groups. And furthermore, if I were to stay in any of those settings long enough, my health outcome would probably take on that of the group to which I've been assigned, even though I have the same genes in all 3 places. So I've defined race as the social interpretation of how one looks in this race-conscious society, and racism as the system that operates on that so-called race by structuring opportunity and by assigning value. What are the impacts of this system? Well, when we do think or talk about racism at all in this country, which is infrequently compared to how often we should, but when we do, we understand that racism unfairly disadvantages some individuals and communities. But it shouldn't take us long to recognize that every unfair disadvantage has its reciprocal unfair advantage, so that racism is also unfairly advantaging other individuals and communities. And that's the whole issue of unearned white privilege that we hardly ever talk about in this country. It actually is quite a quite delicate subject, you know. People get squirmish. And I imagine that maybe some people in this room today have gotten a little squirmish when I said unearned white privilege. Shake it off for right now, because I'm going to tell you a story. No, I'm going to tell you a story that's going to make it even that easy. Just come back with me for right now. Okay, so now we're describing a system that either unfairly disadvantages or unfairly advantages individuals and communities, but there's a third huge impact that most of us do not recognize, and that is how racism saps the strength of our whole society through the waste of human resources. And there are many examples of that. I'm just going to give you 2 for the purposes of time. One huge one is how we as a nation are not yet vigorously investing in the full, excellent public education of all of our children. Because the blindness of racism that makes some of us believe there is no genius in the barrios or the ghettos or on the reservations. We can get along very well, thank you, without those kids. Those same blinders make us not know that there's genius in all of our communities. And if we were to only fully and vigorously invest in that genius, we could be doing so much better as a nation, or even as a world. I often say, we might already be up on Mars farming if that were a good idea, if we were to invest in all that genius. But we wouldn't even have to go to Mars. We could be solving the problems in our communities today if we were to invest in that genius. You know, the lead pipes in Flint would be out. You know, I mean, so many different things. Did you guys see Hidden Figures, by the way? Yeah, right. Okay, so you know I'm telling the truth. Another huge example of how racism saps the strength of all of us is how these same blinders that don't make us not value all of us equally, these same blinders have made us complacent with what I describe as the wholesale warehousing disproportionately of so many black and brown and red men in our prison system, as if that could not separate us from human potential. And if you know people who are either stuck in the prisons or cycling out, because if you have a felony conviction, when you come out, it's hard to get a job, hard to get housing. At some stage, you can't even vote again. So we need to interrupt that cycling. But if you know any of these people either stuck in or cycling in and out, you know that there are many, many geniuses caught up in the system that if there had only been some other way, could be contributing quite productively to our society today. In fact, of the 3 points, the 3 impacts of racism that I've outlined for you, the unfair disadvantage, the reciprocal unfair advantage, and how racism saps the strength of the whole society, I honestly think that we need a lot more attention on that last point. We need media stories about how racism saps the strength of the whole society. We need data collection. We need conversations around our dinner table so that we have more people infused with a sense of urgency to dismantle this system and put in its place a system in which all people can really develop to their full potentials. But now, as a health person, you say, that's a nice definition, Dr. Jones, I understand when you say a system that people don't get concerned that you're trying to decide who's racist and who's not. That's true. I never try to decide that because we all are affected by the system. But to understand how racism turns into a health outcome, I find it useful to think about 3 levels of racism: institutionalized, personally mediated, and internalized. So I'm going to define each of these levels, give you examples of how they can impact health, and then illustrate them with my Gardner's tail allegory. And how many of you are familiar with the Gardner's tail? Wow, that's more than I thought. Wow, thank you all whoever's teaching that. That's wonderful. If you guys have heard the Gardner's tale before, when I tell it again, listen with different ears. Listen with a train-the-trainer kind of ear so you can listen to the nuances of the storytelling so you can confidently tell it back. But first, the definitions. So institutionalized racism is the system, if you will. It's the constellation of structures, policies, practices, norms, and values that taken together result in differential access to the goods, services, and opportunities of society by race. This is the kind of racism, and you know, I know it's hard to write down all this stuff, and we will get the presentation slides to you all, so you can just listen. You know, I'm so sorry that you can't see them while I'm talking, but we will get the presentation slides, so you can just listen, and then the real ahas right now, but you don't have to try to capture my definitions, and I'll look at them to you. So anyway, this is the system that doesn't require an identifiable perpetrator. Because institutionalized racism has been institutionalized in our laws, the customs, and background norms, and often shows up as inherited disadvantage, with reciprocal inherited advantage. We see institutionalized racism in terms of material conditions and in terms of access to power. So examples include differential access to quality housing, or equal educational opportunities, or equal employment opportunities, or even the same level of income at the same level of employment. And clearly, these things impact health. Differential access to medical facilities, including linguistic access. Differential access to a clean environment, and a very well-documented disproportionate placement of toxic dump sites in communities of color, or bus transfer stations in communities of color. And in terms of access to power, well, the power could be information, which could be health information, but it could also be information about our own histories. Power as resources, not just capital resources, but social networking resources, knowing somebody on the board. And power as voice in media, government, and the like. Now, often when I have a slide up there and people read, you know, housing, education, income, wealth, somebody will raise their hand about now and say, Dr. Jones, tell me, when you say housing, education, employment, and wealth, isn't that what we mean when we say social class? So why do you have that on a slide about racism? Are you really talking about racism, or are you really talking about social class? And that's an important question, right? And I know there are a lot of people in this room who might have that question, so let me answer that. And my answer starts with the observation that it doesn't just so happen that people of color in this country are overrepresented in poverty, while white people in this country are overrepresented in wealth. It's not just a happenstance. And for each marginalized or stigmatized or oppressed group of color, there has been some initial historical injustice. So for American Indians, it was the taking of the land and the near genocide. And then for the survivors, moving the survivors to reserved lands, reservations, and then in some instances, something good was found under one reservation. Oops, you got to pick the people up and move them somewhere else. You have people who for generations, for centuries, lived in a part of our land and did not cross the border, but the border crossed them. They were in Mexico, and all of a sudden they're in New Mexico, or Texas, or Arizona, or California. And yet, their children and grandchildren are being harassed daily, right? We could talk about the Chinese laborers brought to build our railroads, unable by law to marry, and unable by law to bring families from China. We could talk about the internment of Japanese folks during World War II, and I am afraid that we are about to enter that again. And you know, if they start some kind of list, we're all supposed to sign up. Did you know that? Right? Okay. And then what about for people of African descent? Well, the initial historical injustice there was the kidnapping of West African people and our importation across the Atlantic with tremendous loss of life in the Middle Passage. And then for the survivors and their progeny, for centuries, what I describe as the coerced usury of our unpaid labor for centuries to build this country. But then some people hear me talking like that, and they're all like, oh, Dr. Jones. There you go, talking about slavery. Dr. Jones, we know that slavery was an unfortunate chapter in our nation's history. But Dr. Jones, don't you know that the enslaved people were emancipated by 1865? And we are now in 2017, so that makes that 152 years ago? So Dr. Jones, all else being equal, don't you think the impacts of slavery would have washed out by now? But the key phrase here, of course, is all else being equal. And all else has not been equal since 1865, and all else still is not equal today. And there are what I describe as contemporary structural factors that are perpetuating each of those initial historical injustices. And these present-day contemporary structural factors are part and parcel of institutionalized racism. So that when people ask me, are you talking about racism or are you really talking about social class? My response is that institutionalized racism explains why we see an association between social class and race in this country. And that is a huge aha. Because what it means is, first of all, let me be clear, we need to eliminate poverty across this land. So we need to eliminate white poverty, black poverty, Hispanic Latino poverty, American Indian poverty, Asian poverty, all poverty. Right? We've got to eliminate it. I would go further. I would eliminate income inequality. I'd flatten the whole thing out, although my husband and I disagree on that. But so give me a magic wand. Oh, okay, thank you. Done, right? Poverty gone, income inequality gone. Even if I had that power, if I were to do that without addressing the background structures, policies, practices, norms and values, the mechanisms of institutionalized racism that were in the background and deliberately put into place to shunt different populations to different possibilities, if I eliminated income inequality today without addressing institutionalized racism, then in one generation, in 20 years, we start to see a stratification by race in terms of income again. So it's an important aha. This is not about racism or social class. It's a both and. And before I leave institutionalized racism, I also need to say that it can be through acts of doing, acts of commission, as well as acts of not doing, acts of omission. And very often, institutionalized racism shows up as inaction in the face of need. The second level of racism that I describe as personally mediated racism, I define as differential assumptions about the abilities, motives, and intents of others by race, and then differential actions based on those assumptions. So this is what most people think of when they hear the word racism. Somebody did something to somebody. It includes the prejudice, the different idea, the discrimination, the different action. And some people call this interpersonal racism. I call it personally mediated racism because I am still understanding racism as a system. And this is the system mediated through people. So how can it impact your health? Well, if you were to look at my slide, the first point on there is police brutality. It's a very old slide. Maybe that's why I didn't want to come up. It's like, oh, I'm too tired. But anyway, I used to talk about police brutality as imagine you were pulled over for driving while black or driving while Latino and interpreted as resisting arrest and hit upside the head. But now we could lift up in this room a litany of things that have come to national attention of unarmed black and brown men and women killed by police officers. So you, Mike Brown, Eric Garner, Freddie Gray, Sam DeBose, Sandra Bland. You know, Trayvon Martin wasn't even a police officer. It was a self-appointed neighborhood watchman who thought that that young boy did not look like he belonged in that neighborhood and hunted him down and killed him. And you know he sold his gun that killed Trayvon on eBay? Did you know that? And the effect of these killings is not just that you've taken out a precious life or completely traumatized a family. There are whole communities that are just bracing ourselves for the next occurrence because for the most part there's been very limited accountability on the police side for these actions. But then we could talk about, let's say, physician disrespect as an example. Physician disrespect, which could be as subtle as a physician not giving a patient the full range of treatment options because the physician figures that patient couldn't afford or wouldn't comply or wouldn't understand or whatever they assume, or it could be quite blatant, like sterilization abuse, which is at many iterations in our nation's history. We have shopkeeper vigilance being followed around in stores, not even ask me, I help you, but just under surveillance. Or waiter indifference, not getting quick, respectful treatment. And these are just two examples of the microaggressions, the subtle communication of disrespect of what some people call everyday racism that might be related to elevated blood pressures in communities of color. Blood pressures that don't even go down at night. And then finally, teacher devaluation. When a teacher looks at a young child and thinks, that child can't learn, and puts them off in the ADD trap, that child will never even know their full potential, much less have the opportunity to develop to their full potential. So all of these examples of personally mediated racism are like institutionalized in that they can be through acts of doing, acts of commission, as well as acts of not doing, acts of omission. But even more important is to recognize that personally mediated racism can be unintentional as well as intentional. You do not have to have intended to do something racist to have had a racist impact. The third level of racism, internalized racism, I define as acceptance by members of stigmatized races of negative messages about our own abilities and intrinsic worth. So here you hear I'm talking about it from the point of view of members of the stigmatized races. And I have friends who do anti-racism training who say, hold up, Camara, what about the internalized sense of entitlement that many white people are walking around with? Isn't that also internalized racism? Yes, it is. I usually don't have that on my slides, but we need to start addressing that today. But for right now, I'm going to just talk about from the point of view of members of the stigmatized races and the detrimental effects, which include self-evaluation, feeling maybe I'm really not as good as. Maybe I shouldn't try to graduate from high school or try to apply to that college, right? Or get that job or live in that neighborhood. It also turns into what my parents' generation called the white man's ISIS Kohler syndrome, because in that generation, if you were a person of color, and it's still true for many of us today, but if you were a person of color, say you're black and you need a lawyer, you might seek out a white lawyer over a black lawyer, right? Or if you were in the hospital, you might prefer a white doctor over a black doctor. In fact, if your water were warm, you might go way down the street to get the white man's ice over the black man's ice, deeply believing that the white man's ice is colder, deeply internalizing the myth of white superiority. And then this internalized racism turns into resignation, helplessness, hopelessness, turns into a lot of self-destructive health behaviors, turns into not registering to vote or not voting even if you are registered, and come on people, too dangerous, right? And really, internalized racism is about members of stigmatized races accepting the limitations to our own full humanity of the box into which we've been placed. So that when you hear young high school students of color, one of them's trying to be the valedictorian and the friends are teasing her or him by saying, well, you know, so-and-so is just trying to be white. We need to challenge that, because since when did white people claim exclusive access to excellence? They did not. So now I'm going to illustrate these three levels of racism, institutionalized, personally mediated, internalized, with one of my teaching stories, one of my allegories on race and racism. This one was sparked by, most of them have been sparked by something I've seen with my own real eyes. So let me tell you what happened in my life, my real Camara Jones life, and then let's make it a story about racism. So, my husband and I had been married about a year, and we were moving back to Baltimore. I was going to finish my PhD at Hopkins. And we bought our first freestanding house, a cute little house with a big wraparound porch, with flower boxes dotted all on the porch. And we bought the house in October, so we weren't thinking about planting at that time. But when spring came, my husband, who is a pediatrician but also an avid gardener, he's running out excited. He wants to plant our marigold seeds to decorate our porch. So he runs out, and then he's like, oh, because some of the boxes had dirt in them, but some of the boxes were empty. But no problem. My husband dutifully goes to the gardening store, and he hauls back big old bags of potting soil, and we fill up the empty boxes, and then we put equal numbers of marigold seeds in all of the boxes, and we water them all. And then because, you know, I'm not the gardener in the family, by this time I'm exhausted, so I just sit back, gonna be delighted, right? Well, 3 weeks later, I'm walking out of my front door onto my porch, and as I looked at the flower boxes, I literally stopped in my tracks. Because as I looked at the boxes, it looked to me like we had planted completely different species in some boxes versus the others. Because some of the boxes were full of plants, and they were tall, vigorous-looking plants. And some of the boxes just had a few plants in them, but they were scrawny and scraggly looking. And then I realized what had happened. That potting soil that my husband had bought turned out to be rich, fertile soil. So that every single seed planted in the rich, fertile soil had sprouted. The strong seed had grown tall and vigorous, and even the weak seed had made it halfway up. But that old soil that we had found there turned out to be poor, rocky soil. So the weak seed planted in the poor, rocky soil just died. And even the strong seed in the poor, rocky soil had to struggle to make it to a middling height. And I see a few of you guys nodding in the audience here, so I've identified the gardeners in this group. And maybe you as a gardener have composted half of your garden. So maybe you've seen this image with your own real eyes, and the image is about the importance of the soil, right? The importance of the environment. Well, now I'm going to take this image and I'm going to make this a story about racism by introducing a gardener. So now we're going to have a gardener who has two flower boxes, one which she knows to have rich, fertile soil, and one which she knows to have poor, rocky soil. And she has seed for the same kind of flowers, except some of the seed is going to produce pink blossoms, and some of the seed is going to produce red blossoms, and the gardener prefers red over pink. So what does she do? She takes the red seed, she puts it in the rich, fertile soil. Pink seed she throws over into the, so this is rich, fertile. Did I say that? Yes, okay. And the poor, I know sometimes, anyway, and she puts the pink over in the poor rocky soil. And 3 weeks later, in her flower boxes, she sees what I saw in mine. In that rich, fertile soil, all the red seed has sprouted, strong red seed, all the vigorous, weak red seed makes it at least halfway up. In the poor rocky soil, weak pink seed dies. Becomes a strong pink seed, struggling to make it to a middling height. And then in those 2 flower boxes, those flowers go to seed. And then the next year, same thing happens. And then those flowers go to seed. And year after year after year after year, the same thing happens. Till finally, about 10 years later, the gardener's looking at her flower boxes, and she said, you know, I was right to prefer red over pink. So we interrupt the story there to say the first part of this story is how institutionalized racism works, where you had the initial historical injustice of the separation of the seed into the 2 types of soil, then the contemporary structural factors of the flower boxes keeping the soil separate, and then through inaction in the face of need, perpetuation of the inequity. But let's pick the story back up to say, okay, well, where is personally mediated racism in this garden? Well, the red flowers, the gardener's looking over red thinking, oh, red is beautiful. And then she looks over at the pink flowers and she says, oh, those pink flowers sure are scrawny and scraggly. So she plucks off the pink blossoms before they can even go to seed. Or she may notice that a pink seed has blown into the rich, fertile soil, so she plucks it out before it can establish itself, which is some of the anti-affirmative action stuff that goes on. And where would internalized racism be in the garden? Well, the red flowers are just living their lives, enjoying being red, many of them not either understanding or acknowledging that they're benefiting from enriched soil. Pink flowers are looking over at red thinking that red is mighty fine, and wishing with all their hearts that they too could be red. And here come the bees, and the bees are minding their own business, collecting nectar, but of course they're pollinating at the same time. So here comes a bee to one of the pink flowers, and then to another pink flower, and then to this pink flower, and this flower's like, get away from me, bee. Do not bring me any of that pink pollen. I prefer the red, because the pink flower has internalized that red is better than pink. So now the question arises, what do we do to set things right in this garden? Well, we could start by addressing the internalized racism. So we can go over to the pink flowers and we can say, pink is beautiful, power to the pink. And that is an important intervention. I'm not making light of it. It is an important intervention, but if that's all we do, it's not going to change the situation in which the pink flowers find themselves. So you might say, oh, okay, I got that. Well, then let's address the personally mediated racism. Let's have a conversation with the gardener. Or better yet, let's have a workplace multicultural workshop for the gardener. It's all good. It's all good. So we have our workshop, right? And in the workshop we say, dear gardener, would you please stop plucking those pink flowers? And maybe she will and maybe she won't. But even if she does, it's still not going to change the situation in which the pink flowers find themselves. If we really want to set things right in this garden, we need to address the institutionalized racism, which means that we have to either break down the boxes and mix up the soil, or if you want to keep separate boxes, that's all right too, although in my mind it makes it easier for the gardener to continue segregating resources going forward. But if you do keep separate boxes, what it means is that you need to enrich the poor rocky soil until it is as rich as the rich fertile soil. And when you do that, the pink flowers will flourish. They'll be looking beautiful, grand, and glorious, so that in that intervention you will have also addressed the internalized racism. Because pink will no longer be looking over at red thinking red is better or wanting to be red. And in that intervention on the institutionalized, you may also address the, the personally mediated racism. Now, let me say that the original gardener may have to go to her grave preferring red over pink, but her children, who grow up seeing the flowers equally beautiful, will be less likely to have that kind of attitude. So this story is to illustrate the 3 levels of racism, strongly suggest that if we want to set things right in the garden, we need to at least address the institutionalized, good to do all at the same time. But when we do address the institutionalized racism, the other levels may take care of themselves. But before I leave the story, there's one more question that we haven't asked, and that is, who is the gardener? After all, the gardener is the one that I gave the power to decide, the power to act, control of resources, which in my mind are actually the elements of self-determination, right? Who is the gardener? Well, I used to have my slides say government, power to decide, power to act, control the resources. That's until I went to work for CDC, which is a part of government. So I changed my slide, all governments, right? But that doesn't make government not a part of the gardener. Government's a huge part of the gardener, but government is not the only part of the gardener. So we have foundations, corporations, media, communities themselves to the extent that they have self-determination. But whoever the gardener is, it is dangerous when the gardener is alive with one group. I paint her red. That's why she prefers red over pink. And it's also dangerous when she's not concerned with equity. When she can look at her flower boxes and think that her garden is beautiful, thank you, but she's not even counting the pink flowers as part of the garden. And our challenge is what to do about the garden. Do we make the garden? Stripe the polka dot in our picture? Do the flowers have to grow? Recruit their own garden? Lots of questions that can come out of this story. And I see that many people are leaving. What time is it? Is it 5:35? Can you guys give me till 6 for those? Everybody who needs to leave because they have kids or they have an appointment or another class, you guys get up now. I'm doing a little break. Everybody who needs to leave. And everybody else, I'm going to tell you a few more stories. I'm not going to give you everything that I was going to give because we have the time to take, but I'm going to tell you a few more stories and a few other tools that we really need. And thank you all. I know you're sorry to leave, so I want to share with you before I leave the gardener's tale just a few questions that have been asked before. And if any of you has a burning question right now, I'd also like to entertain it, but let me share the three from before. Once I was telling this story, and then somebody's hand shot up and they said, "Excuse me, Dr. Jones, but why should the red flowers share their soil?" I was like, wow, I love that question, because it showed the power of this story to start conversations on racism that would be otherwise difficult if we were talking about racism between you and me, right? My answer to the question, why should the red flowers share their soil, is that actually, that soil doesn't belong to the red flowers, it belongs to the whole garden. Here's another question. When I show the picture there, what we're looking at is not the original gardener, but it's the gardener's great-great-great-great-grandchild. What then? Because that here we are, right? And that great-great-great-great-grandchild has grown up, used to seeing the pink flowers and the red flowers looking different, in height and vigor. They think that that's the natural order of things. So with that, there are three huge things that I want to touch on briefly. The first is we must make the differences in the height and vigor of the pink and red flowers a problem that needs to urgently be solved. And then once we make that, once we devote our attention to that, we also need to make the flower boxes transparent. We need to be talking about the differences in the quality of the soil. That's the only way we're going to get a handle on solving the problem. And when we make the flower boxes transparent, we need to be clear that the pink seed did not just launch themselves into the poor rocky soil, right? So we have to talk about history, and we must talk about the gardener's agency in all this and setting up the whole situation. The gardener's initial preference for red over pink that set up the whole situation. In our, some people call that cultural racism. In our context, it's white supremacist ideology, but we must address that. My story for decades was about just differences in the quality of the soil until I recognized one day in the telling that even if we were to compel the gardener to equalize the soil today, if she continues to prefer red over pink, she will find ways to privilege red over pink going forward. So we not only have to address with the opportunity structures, but we also have to address the value assignment. This notion that was heard in our last campaign as "Make America White Again," right? That was the dogmas. That was clearly heard. Here's the third question that I want to bring up. It's never been asked me this way, but I started thinking, what about the red seed that finds itself in the poor rocky soil? Now, of course, the pink seed also finds itself in the poor rocky soil. It's not like the red seed finds itself in the pink seed soil. It's not about that, you understand? Right? So, but what about the red seed that finds itself in the poor rocky soil? And what we have seen today is that instead of the red and pink seed finding common cause and trying to enrich the soil together, the red seed, feeling entitled to the rich, fertile soil, believes a gardener who has never cared about that red seed in the poor rocky soil. When that gardener says, "I'll take care of you because you're red like me." And in fact, when I talked earlier about the impacts of racism and the unfair disadvantage, the reciprocal unfair advantage, and how racism saps the strength of the whole society, I need to add a fourth, because racism saps the strength of the whole society through making people vote against their own interest. It has always been used that way. After the emancipation of the enslaved Africans, and you had sharecroppers, black and white, and the white landowner said to the white sharecroppers, you have no common cause with those black folks. So they didn't rise up. In union efforts in the 1920s and 1930s, black unions and white unions kept them separate because the white folks figured they had nothing, they were after all white. And now in this election, so this is a huge problem that we need to recognize. Racism has always been used to divide people, not only from one another, but from their own interests. And I think that some of those red seeds that were just hoping and praying that the red gardener was going to move them or do something for them, he never did, and he never will. Anyway, any questions about the gardener's tale right now? Okay, well, I'll just carry on. Usually at about this point, so I will show you some data, which we can't do because I can describe it, but you'd be like, from the description. It's very compelling data. So I want to send you to a paper by Jones et al. In the 2008 Ethnicity and Disease. We wanted to call the paper The Health Benefits of Living White, and the real name of it is Using Socially Assigned Race to Probe White Advantages in Health Status. We had to get it out of CDC some kind of way. Right? But anyway, Jones, Ethnicity and Disease, 2008, very powerful stuff. But then there's a question, how is racism operating here, which is a legitimate question that you can ask. Racism is not a cloud, it's not a miasma that we can't get a handle on. It is a system, as I've described. And it's a system with identifiable and addressable mechanisms, which are in our structures, policies, practices, norms, and values, which can be understood as the elements of decision-making. So structures are the who, what, when, and where of decision-making. Who's at the table and who's not. What's on the agenda, what's not. And all of you are going to find yourselves at decision-making tables. And when you do, your first job should be to look around and say, who is not here? Who has an interest in this proceeding? And then your job is not just to represent their interests, but to actually find them a way to the table. What's on the agenda, what's not. We're parts of lots of collectives, but we don't always put important things on the agenda. So that's structures. And the structures are the who, what, when, and where of decision-making. Policies are the written how of decision-making. And again, we have to get used to looking at the axis of. So don't just examine the policies that are on the books, but what policies should be on the books that, if put in place, would make things better. And then if policies are the written how, then practices and norms are the unwritten how of decision making. A little harder to tap, the shoulder tapping that names somebody to some board, that kind of thing. And then values are the why. And I used to never think about values. I thought values was maybe a religious thing, a philosophy thing. I was a hard scientist, and then structural analysis and all that. But as I said, values are important because if the gardener continues to prefer red over pink, they will find every kind of way to privilege red over pink. So we must address the values piece as well. Let me see what I want to talk about now. Well, I would say yes.
Can I ask you one question?
Yes.
Camara?
Just getting back to the gardener's tale, the pink flowers that are in the rocky soil for many generations, do they become genetically different and disadvantaged over time because in terms of kind of their disease status?
So I think the pink soil, so there's a strong science of epigenetics looking at heritable characteristics that are not in the genome itself. They're not in the DNA, but they're in how the DNA is expressed, so epigenetics, and we have good evidence of that. And so some people might call that the post-slavery, post-slave syndrome, anyway, or American Indians talk about it in terms of trauma, inherited trauma and all of that. That stuff is real, but I actually look at it a different way. I think that pink seed has been selected for survival and strength. And if we were to only do the experiment of providing a rich soil, we might actually find them looking better than the red. But that is the fear. That is the fear of the red. I used to say that all the time. You notice I didn't say that today. But I used to say that the pink flowers, that seed being selected for survival and strength might, given the equal soil, look better. That's why people are up and down. That's why we're having this last convulsion in our society. Okay? And so I don't say that every time, but I don't think that they are damaged. I think they're still surviving, and if just given the chance. And the hard part is the gardener's great-great-great-great-grandchild looking at the flowers, always seeing them that way, without being historical, without asking how did things come to be this way. And that's one of our huge barriers to achieving social and health equity is we're ahistorical. But if that great-great-great-grandchild doesn't ask, then it may never occur to them to do the experiment of enriching the soil. They may just think that there is something stunted, or not stunted, but innately shorter and worse looking about the pink. We just need somebody to have belief in the equal, I guess, potential. We need to have investment in equal potential in our society today. And I think if we just do that over a generation, you know, foundations, sometimes they do those 3-year, 5-year things because they want to catalyze change. They need to invest in change, right? And they need to invest not in trying to see outcomes, they need to invest in opportunities, and the outcomes will manifest in a generation, right? So I think it's quite the opposite, actually. I mean, we see the stunting because of the soil. As soon as we do something with that soil, it's going to be great. Might take one generation to wash out, not two. Other questions about the garbage here? Okay, so now that definition I gave you of racism, a system of structuring opportunity and assigning value based on race, can be generalized to be a definition of any system of structured inequity. So what is sexism? That's a system of structuring opportunity and assigning value based on gender that unfairly disadvantages some, unfairly advantages others, and saps the strength of the whole society through the waste of human resources. And I recognize that there are many axes of inequity operating in our society today, intersecting in communities and in individuals. That's the whole intersectionality thing. So, you know, I have a whole list of like 13 of them, but you can call them out, right? Then I show that they're all risk markers for how opportunity is structured and value assigned, even as a smaller set of them are risk factors in the progression to disease. People say, well, you just spent this whole hour talking about racism, and now you're going to acknowledge that sexism exists and all like that? What's up with that? So, I recognize all of these systems of inequity. Why do I spend my career focusing on race as an axis of inequity and racism as a system? It's because racism is foundational in our nation's history. And yet many people are in denial of its continued existence and profound impacts on the health and well-being of our nation. So we must address race and racism even as we address some of the others. And honestly, to the extent that we start dismantling the system of race and racism, the others will benefit as well. I would like to share with you my definition of health equity, some barriers to achieving health equity, and a quick discussion of strategies. That's one thing. I want to share with you ISERD, and then I want to share with you true stories. Do you have time for that? Okay. So, health equity is now the new thing. 10 years ago we were talking about eliminating health disparities, and now we're talking about achieving health equity. And that was quite a jolt for some people, and now people are trying to define, well, what do you really mean by health equity? So I'm going to share with you my 3-part definition of health equity, what it is, how we get there, and how it's related to health disparities. And this is related to the Healthy People 2020 definition of health equity, to which I contributed, but I could tweak mine afterward. That one went through clearance and it got stuck. So, right, so I'll tell you what the difference is. So I define health equity as assurance of the conditions for optimal health for all people. Healthy People 2020 defines health equity as attainment of the highest level of health for all people. I agree that that's our goal. We're on the same wavelength there. But in my mind, what if we hit that last Sunday? Are we done? And I don't think that health equity is an outcome. Health equity is a process. Which process? Assurance, which is actually one of the 3 core functions of public health that were identified by the Institute of Medicine along with assessment and policy development. Assurance of what? Of the conditions for optimal health, the so-called social determinants of health. For whom? For all people. That makes it equity. How do we get there? Achieving health equity requires at least these 3 things. Valuing all individuals and populations equally, recognizing and rectifying historical injustices, and providing resources not equally but according to need. And then how is health equity related to health disparities? Health disparities will be eliminated when health equity is achieved. Health disparities is counting the different number of different colored bodies at the bottom of the cliff, or the differences in the height and vigor of the pink and red flowers. That's about outcomes. Health equity is all the stuff that came before. So why haven't we achieved health equity? There are at least 3 huge barriers to achieving health equity in this country. The first is that we have a very narrow focus on the individual. We have a very narrow sense of even who is we. We don't even count extended family sometimes, right? Very narrow sense of interdependence. There, but for the grace of God, go on, we're all in this together. Very narrow on that. Very narrow sense of collective efficacy. Even some of us now are thinking, what am I going to do about this situation that we're in today in this country? Not what are we going to do? And when you are narrowly focused on the individual, it means that systems and structures are invisible or irrelevant. The second huge barrier to achieving health equity in this country is that we are ahistorical. We think that the current distribution of advantage and disadvantage is a happenstance. We think that the present is disconnected from the past. And when you're like that, then systems and structures either are immutable, because I was born, it was that way, and it's always going to be that way, or again, irrelevant. And the third huge barrier is the endorsement of the myth of meritocracy, the endorsement of the story that goes something like this: if you work hard, you'll make it. Now, most people who have made it have worked hard. Okay, not everybody who's made it has worked hard, but most people who have made it have worked hard. But there are many, 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 many other people working just as hard or harder who will never make it because of an uneven playing field. And racism and all these other systems of structured inequity are core in not only establishing but maintaining that uneven playing field. And in our country, there are two thoughts that you could have. You could think that babies are born with equal potential, or you could think that babies are born with equal opportunity. But you can't hold these two thoughts in your mind at the same time. If you think that two babies are born with equal potential and then they grow up with uneven outcomes, you have to look outside of them as structures and systems to explain that. But if you think that two babies are born with equal opportunity and then they grow up with uneven outcomes, you think this one is lazy or stupid. Right? We do not yet have equal opportunity in our society. And we need to acknowledge that, right? We need to debunk this myth of meritocracy. So there are lots of strategies that I was going to share with you. I just want to say that in terms of opportunity structures, we need to create bridges to opportunity, not just tear down barriers, but create bridges. So, for example, community colleges to me are a really good bridge. We need to, in terms of value assignment, understand our common humanity. We need to burst through the bubbles that we're all in. Each of us is in a bubble. A bubble of our work, and our school, and our family, and our church maybe, or choir, or whatever it is. And some of our bubbles are thick plastic glass, and some are soap bubbles, but we're all in a bubble, not knowing that just across town there are people who are just as kind, funny, generous, hardworking, smart, as we are, who live in very different circumstances. So we need to create opportunities to burst through those bubbles. School partnerships, 7th grade classes from the public and private school sharing the same 7th grade science class or whatever. We need to create those so that we can understand our common humanity, that we can not only be interested in our common humanity, we can believe it and join in the stories of others. So from there, I said ICERD. Anybody in this room ever heard of ICERD? Okay, what is it? It's the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, ICERD. What is it? It's an international anti-racism treaty. That there even existed an international anti-racism treaty. But it does exist. It was signed into being in 1965 by the United Nations. So here's a question for you. Do you think the U.S. signed this treaty? No. Just like a resounding no. But surprise, surprise, yes. We did. We signed the treaty in 1966. But the key there is our diplomats can go and sign any treaty they want, right? But if the Senate doesn't ratify the treaty, then it has no impact on us. So here's another question. Do you think the U.S. Senate has ratified this treaty? So now your little face is like, I don't know. It's a trick question. Yes, the Senate ratified it. The Senate ratified it 28 years later in 1994. But what that means is that today we have international treaty obligations to do right under this 9-page treaty. One of the obligations is to submit periodic reports. So about every 6 years, our State Department submits a report. The last report is 69 pages. This is no joke. This is not something I imagined or found in a corner somewhere. This is a real thing, right? And so the State Department sends this report to a UN committee called the CERD, and anybody else can submit a parallel or alternative report, shadow report. So Wellesley College can submit a shadow report. And the committee reads all of these. They read 82 parallel reports with the one that was submitted in 2013. And then in 2014, they sent back to us their concluding observations, which was only 14 pages long. It's not a telephone book, so I hope that all of you guys can read this by the end of this week, okay? And the concluding observations start out, thank you, United States, for your report. We remain concerned about racial profiling, disproportionate incarceration, residential segregation, differential access to health care, the achievement gap in education, and on and on and on. And not only do they remain concerned about, they actually have specific recommendations for each of those points. So when you look at the slides, I point you to what paragraph is what, right? They also say, dear United States, you need to establish a national action plan to combat structural racial discrimination. We have an obligation to do that. And they also say, dear United States, please let your people know about the existence of this treaty. So every time I talk, I do. And every time I talk, I do my part. So, I also want to just tell you, if you go to www.apha, American Public Health Association.org/racism, we have a little racism page there. So if you have more resources you want to send to us, and on that page, we already have established an anti-racism collaborative with 8 collective action teams. We have 140 people like APHA members involved right now. I'm hoping that in a month we'll have a badge or a button, something people can say, I want to join, and you can participate even if you're not a member of APHA. But you could become a student member of APHA for only $65. I know it's a lot of money, but if you wanted to be part. So now I'm going to end with 2 stories. This first one, the first of the last, I call Dual Reality, a restaurant saga. This was sparked by my own real life experience when I was a medical student. So some friends and I were studying in my apartment, and we were studying long and hard, and it got late, and we got hungry, and I had no food in the apartment. So we decided we're going to go into town and find a restaurant. So we go into town and we find a restaurant, we walk in, we sit down, the menus are presented, we order our food, food is served, and we're sitting here eating. Not a very inspiring story yet, right? But as I sat there eating, I looked across the room and I noticed a sign, and the sign was a startling revelation to me about how racism works. So now you're very interested right now. What did the sign say? Well, what did the sign say? The sign said open. So now I lost you again. Okay. So let's recap. Here we are, sitting, eating. I look up, I see a sign that says open. If I hadn't thought anything more about it, I would have assumed that other hungry people could walk in, sit down, order their food and eat, but I knew something about the two-sided nature of those signs, and I recognized that now due to the hour, the restaurant was indeed closed, and the people just a few feet away from me, but on the other side of the sign, would not be able to come in, sit down and eat. And then I understood how racism structures open, closed signs in our society. I understood how racism structures a dual reality. And for those who are inside the restaurant, sitting at the table of opportunity, eating, and they look up and they see a sign that says open, they don't even know that there's a two-sided sign going on, because it is difficult for any of us to recognize a system of inequity that privileges us. It is difficult for men to recognize male privilege and sexism. It is difficult for white Americans to recognize white privilege and racism. It is difficult for all Americans to recognize our American privilege in the global context, except on the health side, we got a little taste of that with Ebola, did we not? Yet those on the outside are very well aware there's a two-sided sign going on because it proclaims close to them, but they can look through the window and see people inside eating. So back inside the restaurant, to those who say, is there really a two-sided sign going on? You know, does racism really exist? I say, I know it's hard for you to know when you only see open. In fact, that's part of your privilege, not to have to know. But once you do know, you can choose to act. So it's not a scary thing to name racism, it's an empowering thing. It doesn't even compel you to act, but it equips you to act. So that if you care anything about the people on the other side of the sign, and that is an if, but if you do, you might even talk to the restaurant owner who lives after all inside with you. You might say, why don't you open the restaurant again? There are hungry people outside. Let them come in. You'll make more money, and oh, the conversations we can have. Or maybe you'll pass food out the door, or break the glass, or tear down the sign, but at least what you won't be doing is sitting back saying, wonder why those people don't just come on in and sit down and eat, because you'll understand something about the two-sided nature of the sign. And then the final story, do I have time for the final story? Yes. 1 minute, okay. This one I'm actually going to walk with, okay? So first of all, just to say that this story is not based on something I saw with my own real eyes. It's based on an image from the book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? And Other Conversations About Race by Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum. In her book, she describes racism for most people as a passive process. People are just living their lives, but they're living their lives on a people mover, on a conveyor belt. So they're going to work and taking care of the kids, but they're on this people mover that is actually moving through racism and toward racism, but they don't even realize it. I'm going to take her image about racism for most people as a passive process and a people mover, and I'm going to expand on it to talk about how we become actively anti-racist. So here we are on this conveyor belt, on this people mover. So we're on this people mover, we're just going to school, going to work, we're moving inexorably through racism and toward racism. In fact, there's a big sign up there that says racism, racism, racism. But most of us are not even looking at that because we're so involved in our lives. And some people do look up and they go like, oh, and then they close their eyes. So they're in denial and they stay on this thing. And they might look up and they go, oh, right? If they don't do anything else, maybe these are colorblind, right? They turn around and what are we going to do now that we recognize, well, maybe racism really does exist? Well, here we are, the people movement. We look up, we see the sign that says racism. We're going to turn around. But not only are we going to turn around, we have to start walking, right? We need to take a step and then another step and another. We have to become actively anti-racist. And we have to walk at least as fast as the conveyor belt is moving just to stay in the same place, right? And then let me ask you this. What happens when you're walking backwards in a crowded conveyor? You bump into people and it becomes uncomfortable for them and uncomfortable for you. And they're like, hey, buddy, watch out. What are you doing? And this is your time to do the first of the 3 stages of being, actively anti-racist, which is to name racism, to say, do you see where we're going? Do you want to go there? Or will you turn around and walk with me? And most people will not want to be disturbed out of their comfort. So most people say, well, just go on and get out of my way. But maybe 1 or 2 will turn. So now you have 2 or 3 walking backwards on this crowded conveyor belt, you keep bumping into people, and more will turn, never 50%, so don't hold on for that. But now that you take a critical mass, now you don't even have to stay in the same place. Now you can start making some progress, not even just away from the sign, but actually what you're trying to do, you're trying to understand the system. You're trying to get to the motor, to figure out how the system's working. So this is where you now do the second of the 3 stages of being actively anti-racist, which is to ask the question, how is racism operating here? Looking at structures, policies, practices, norms, and values. And I think it's this lever. So I grab the lever. And the whole system starts shaking it. I've done it. Except racism is a very fancy system. And it figures this out and keeps on going. We're just pointing out the importance of the 3rd stage of being actively anti-racist, which is to organize and strategize to act. So while I'm pulling on the lever, I need you to push a button. I need you to pull on that pulley. I need you to swing a lever, and each of us needs to take a piece of this system. And when we do, I think that we can dismantle this system and put in its place a system in which all people can know and develop to their full potentials. I'm so sorry about the slides and everything, but thank you for this opportunity to talk.